So, all right. Well, good to see everybody. My name is Will Inboden, a professor here and the director of the Hamilton Center, one of your hosts for tonight's event. And this is our first public event of the year, our first campus event of the year. And it's very fitting that we'll be hearing from our distinguished guest and addressing topics of such weighty consequence. I first do, of course, want to thank our valued co-sponsors, the Bob Graham Center and the Alexander Hamilton Society, both special partners and fellow travelers with the Hamilton Center and our broader mission of bringing thoughtful voices with a range of views on the pressing policy challenges of the day as well as the eternal questions. I should mention, and you can find more of this on our website or our social media, that we do have some other events coming up throughout the semester, including Major Charles Dunlap, a retired Army JAG general now with Duke University, on October 3rd, talking about the challenges of the laws of war. Rabbi Meir Soloveichik and our own Darren Staloff on October 21st, talking about religion in America. And then Tara Isabella Burton on November 6th, talking about spirituality and religion. So keep an eye out for those events. So tonight heralds what we might call the public debut, the coming out, if you will, of Walter Russell Mead as one of the newest members of the Hamilton Center faculty. And we're very excited to have him. He is one of the foremost geopolitical thinkers of our day, widely consulted by heads of state and other policy leaders and scholars. In addition to his Hamilton faculty role, he's also the Ravenel Curry Chair at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and the weekly Global View columnist for the Wall Street Journal. His previous roles include being the Henry Kissinger Fellow for Grand Strategy at the Council on Foreign Relations and faculty positions at Bard College and with Yale University's Venerable Grand Strategy program. He's also the author of numerous path-breaking books, including Special Providence, God and Gold, and Ark of the Covenant, all of them in different ways, remarkable and innovative synthetic treatments of questions about America and Britain's past, and then our present role in the world. All of them, of course, are staples of graduate school qualifying exams as well, which is where I first countered some of his work. Tonight, he will, for our format, he'll be first lecturing on Our Dangerous World, as per the title. Once he wraps that up, I'll come up here and I'll put a few friendly or maybe more provocative questions to him, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions from all of you. So please be ready for those. Please join me in giving a warm University of Florida welcome to the newest member of our academic community, Walter Russell Mead.
Thanks, Will, for the introduction and for all the things you're doing to make Hamilton Center great. I can't really say great again, but great. And it's really great to be here at the University of Florida. And I've been here before as a guest. Now I'm appearing as actually a citizen of Gator Nation. I'm hearing that this is not the best fall to join Gator Nation, that there's a certain amount of mourning and disconsolate stuff around here. All I can say is I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and they are processing their 70 to 50 loss to JMU. So, you guys don't have it that bad here. All right. I want to talk about three things tonight, all under the heading of the world in crisis, our dangerous world. And then hopefully I'll say enough that is interesting or provocative that at least some of you will ask some questions. I do see that at the University of Florida you leave lots of empty spaces in the front row, like students throughout the world who, generally speaking, try to sit as far from the speaker as possible. If any of you have the misfortune to go on into a journalistic career, you'll find out it's just the opposite. When there's a press conference or something like that, everybody wants to be in the front row. So you can, as a speaker, you can usually tell what kind of audience you've got by just casually looking at the seating. All right. So the first thing we need to talk about tonight is the current world system. That is, what if we talk about a world in crisis, what is that world? And the world that we live in today, was basically something that the foundations were laid in the 1940s. And they were laid by people who had gone through an absolutely horrifying first half of the 20th century. Because we don't, unless you really sort of start to try to imaginatively put yourselves in the shoes of some of those people, it's hard to see just how bad it was. But think about World War I, 1914 to 1918. You had, for the first time in the United States, you had in our history, you had a draft for an overseas war. Hundreds of thousands of people mobilized. The economy, society disrupted. In Europe, it was horribly worse with the trench warfare for 4 years, hideous casualties. And then the end of the war comes in 1918, a huge sigh of relief. People were really saying it's the end of history. Because now we all know that war is so terrible, we'll never have one of those again. We're done with that. And so we're going to set up a system in Europe and in America that's going to prevent this from happening again. We are not going to make the mistakes that led to World War I. Well, just 20 years later, World War II breaks out. So if you were 18 years old at the end of World War I, right, you are now, your son perhaps, or daughter is 18 years old at the start of World War II. And the people who had themselves gone into the trenches and went through the horrifying experiences of that combat are now sending their own kids into exactly the same kind of meat grinder, made worse in some ways because advances in modern technology had made weapons more destructive, ammunition more powerful, casualty rates higher in many types of battle. And, of course, the war ends with the explosions, the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you didn't have to be a great genius. You didn't need to be a Henry Kissinger to see what this trajectory looks like. Wars every 20 years, each one worse than the last. Where is this going to end? By the end of World War II, tens of millions were dead. People all over the world were literally starving. Food supplies had been disrupted. Markets had been disrupted. You think of all the soldiers mobilized, kept away from their families, young men sort of from 18. In some cases, as the war went on, they started drafting younger at 16, off in these terrible conditions, POW camps all over Europe and America. The deliberate destruction of the civil infrastructure required to keep economies going, destruction of roads, railroads, bridges, the major cities of Europe mostly bombed to complete destruction, devastation in Japan on a scale that no one had ever seen, and the horror and the fear that something like this would happen again was the strongest passion, that political passion that people knew. We are not going to do this. Okay, at the end of World War I, America didn't join the League of Nations. Well, this time we're going to join the UN. We didn't cement a global trading system. This time we're going to have a global trading system. We didn't get a good financial system going. This time we're going to have the Bretton Woods economic system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so many of the institutions of the contemporary world had their roots in this moment of never again. People sometimes talk about never again as if that were only about the Holocaust. But for that whole generation, never again was about never again for world war. All right. Well, almost immediately afterwards, you get the Cold War, which thankfully never turned into a full-scale hot war. But since 1945, we have not seen a return to real World War conditions. Unfortunately, we are now facing, for the first time since 1945, the realistic prospect that we might see this kind of outbreak again. Why? What happened? Well, some of the problems, first of all, no human system is ever going to be perfect. And as things change, you have to keep updating and reforming things that used to work that may not fit what you've got now. And sometimes the architects of the international system were successful in adapting to change. Best example of this would be the Bretton Woods economic system after World War II. It involved fixed exchange rates so that every currency was always worth the same amount compared to the US dollar, and the US dollar was on the gold standard. So there was a fixed standard. And during that time, it was very rare for a country to change the value of its currency, up or down. But by the late 1960s, this system was no longer working very well. The US was kind of running out of gold. We had balance of payments deficits, and countries like France that didn't like the power that this system seemed to give the United States were doing what they could. They were taking gold taking dollars, paper money to Fort Knox and saying, "Gimme, gimme," trying to drain out the gold. And so the Nixon administration sort of brought an end to the Bretton Woods system, and we began what we now have, a system of floating exchange rates, which we've managed with fairly well. We've had economic crises and so on, but basically, since then, for 50 years, the world economy has grown substantially using this new system. But in other cases, we've either failed to reform or the reforms haven't worked as well. I think the biggest case of the failure to adjust and reform is the United Nations, where the UN Security Council, the permanent members who have vetoes, reflect the great powers of 1945. So that's, or at least the powers in some cases that we were going to pretend to say were great in 1945. So you have the United States, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. Russia has inherited the Soviet seat. You would not, if you were picking the 5 most important countries in the world today, no one would pick that number, that group. It leaves off India, it leaves off China. There are no Islamic countries, there is no African country, there is no South American country on that list. And so the United Nations Security Council no longer represents anything sensible. And in the same way, the General Assembly, when the UN started, the General Assembly was had only about 50, 60 members. Now it has almost 200, and it doesn't really work. And by the way, in the UN system, formally speaking, India is equal to Luxembourg. That is, they each have 1 vote in the General Assembly. This is ridiculous. And yet there really is no way to reform it, or if there is one, no one has found it, because the permanent members of the Security Council can and will veto reforms that they don't like. So the UN is less and less representative of anything, and works less and less effectively, and has less and less prestige. There actually was a time, barely within living memory, when General Assembly votes were front page news in newspapers all over the world. Of course, there used to be something called newspapers. Some of you are old enough to remember those. But it used to be a really big deal when the United Nations General Assembly would take a vote on something. Today, no one pays any attention at all to these votes. So, and then you have other cases where we did a reform and it didn't work that well. The trading system that was set up after World War II was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, GATT. And the GATT system has been replaced in the 1990s by the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The WTO was meant to be a tremendous improvement on GATT that would have better rules, clearer rules, provide more effective adjudication of trade disputes. But in fact, it just simply permitted China, through systematic cheating, to create an entirely new international situation that the framers of the WTO had no idea about. So the system itself has is showing signs of old age. And that's one of the reasons that we are living in a world in which so many things that once seemed stable or ought to seem stable are now looking kind of fragile and clunky. Then we have, in addition to that, there are new global issues that just weren't on the table in the 1940s. For example, you have, no one was thinking about climate change in the 1940s. And this is an incredibly difficult problem for diplomacy to solve. I won't get into the details, but diplomacy generally is good at settling a very specific issue. So in the 1890s, the fur seals were being hunted to extinction. And none of the sealing nations wanted this to happen. So what they did was they came up with a treaty limiting the number of seals that any country could catch. And it worked pretty well. It was a treaty about one thing where there was a common interest. But if you think of trying to solve the climate issue through diplomacy, carbon dioxide emissions and methane emissions and so on involve basically like what kind of car does everybody drive? How fast does a given economy grow? What technologies does every industry in a country use? What kinds of factories are you allowed to build? To try to manage something like that through the international system is just a job that, very few governments actually can do this well. I don't think a single government today is actually fulfilling the pledges that were made at the Paris Accords. So you've got a problem where single governments can't do it, and it's even less likely that groups of governments or a global assembly of nations is going to manage it. But that's, you have other global issues like migration. Today, if you go to a country like India, there are 1 billion+ people who now have cell phones living in tiny, impoverished villages who can see on their cell phone that life in the United States or life in Europe is just a lot better than anything they ever dreamed was possible. And this may shock you, but a lot of people want to go to where things are better, especially young people, right? And then at the same time, air travel is faster and cheaper than it's ever been before. And we are seeing more and more airports built as countries develop. So it's getting easier and easier to travel. There are more places with good roads and so on and so on. So more travel, cheaper travel, more awareness of the benefits of migration. You start seeing a pattern there. And I would say, and right now we have a system, again, a lot of Americans may not know this or pay attention to it because we don't think about it. But if you're a young American, you're 19, 20 years old, and you decide you want to take a gap year, and you want to just like in your gap year, you want to basically go backpacking around the world and just see what's out there. Stay in youth hostels. You don't have a lot of money. You're 20 years old. But on the other hand, you can like handle some hardships, and you're just really, really curious and you want to see the world. Well, you know what? If you're an American, you can just do that. But if, say, you're Turkish or Indian, you're not going to be able to get visas to most countries because they'll be afraid that you're a migrant who's going to want to stay. And before they'll let you in, you either have to be enrolling in a university and often paying the money to go, or you have to be someone who's got a terrific job and family and business back home that they know you're going to want to return to. So this is a profoundly unequal world where some young people are privileged to be able to travel the world and see freely almost anything they'd like, while others are really stuck in a handful of countries. And the privileged people, by and large, don't know this and don't think about it. The underprivileged people know it and think about it, and I don't want to shock you here, resent it. So the world system has problems that we're not very good at solving. And I would also add to this the sort of rise of new technologies ranging from cyber, AI, to sort of biological innovation. Think of the Wuhan wet market or lab issues, if you would like. But also think that every day there are thousands of cyber attacks that cross international boundaries, that your computer, your cell phone actually exists in a poorly governed international space where criminals and foreign governments and other bad actors can and will get in there and in various ways steal your money, steal your information, or as we just saw in Lebanon the other day, blow up your pager. So the international system hasn't the faintest clue how to deal with these problems. I can't blame the international system for this because nobody else does really either. Life is throwing new problems at humanity faster than humanity at this point is coming up with ways of handling them. So we have these are all reasons why the international system is under stress. But there are, at this point in time, what we also see is a group of countries that want to destroy the post-World War II system, either because they want to replace it with another system or because they don't like these systems and they want to kind of go back to an older way of where every country is just kind of in there for itself. There are no rules, and certainly there's no American superpower telling everybody what you can and can't do. And there are a long list of countries who belong in this group, but the big ones, China, Russia, and Iran, are the ones that are driving a lot of the news today and are the ones whose activities could well bring us, in some cases already have brought us to the threshold of great power war for the first time since the 1940s. I will speak briefly about each of these countries, their objectives, and what they're doing. And then I'll go on to the third part of my talk, and what should we be doing about these problems? Let's begin with the biggest and in some ways the middle to long term, possibly even short term, most dangerous and capable of these countries, and that's the People's Republic of China. China is a country that in some basic ways feels that the current international order is unfair to China. Some of these are reasonable, I think. The international system is not perfect and is not going to be perfect. And there are many ways in which it rubs some countries wrong, and it rubs some countries wronger than it does others. China was, and particularly the communist Chinese were not around when the rules were being written in the 1940s, basically because Mao didn't take over until 1949, and then after that the United States kept communist China out of the UN as long as it could up into the 1970s. So the Chinese, don't necessarily feel that they have any kind of, that these rules have any hold over them or any legitimacy, and that's one problem. The most specific one is that the island of Taiwan, in the eye of the Chinese Communist Party, the government in Beijing, is a part of China. And the United States, since 1949, has been illegitimately using American military to keep China divided and to prevent the People's Republic of China from integrating the island of Taiwan with the motherland, as of course it is the duty of every Chinese government to do. That, now you might think, why is this a big deal? Why does anybody care about Taiwan? Why do we care about, why should we Americans care about Taiwan? And for that matter, why should the Chinese care so much about Taiwan? Well, there are sentimental and nationalist reasons for the Chinese to care about Taiwan. But I think there are also some very important national security strategic reasons why people would care. The one that you hear talked about most often is this idea that the semiconductors that they make in Taiwan are the cutting-edge semiconductors, and without access to those facilities, the world's economy would grind to a halt. There is some truth to this, actually. If the island of Taiwan were to disappear tomorrow, a lot of us would very soon find it was getting a lot harder to replace our cell phone and to do other things that we sort of normally think are not a problem. And that's just not a problem for consumers. Businesses would suddenly find they couldn't get, I'm trying to build my new AI and I can't get the chips that I need for it. Amazon is trying to keep its data center running. Your bank is trying to keep track of how much money is in everyone's accounts. And without access to these semiconductors, we wouldn't be able to do these things, at least not reliably. So that's part of it, and it's serious. But more than this is if you look at a map, you'll see that the island of Taiwan geographically is in a place where the main sea lanes that connect Japan and Korea to the Middle East, to Europe, to Africa, and beyond pass in and around those seas. If the United States Navy were to disappear from those waters, evicted by China, or simply because we decided to go home, and the Chinese Navy replaced it, essentially China would have the ability to tell Japan and Korea what they could and couldn't trade with the rest of the world. And what I've heard from very senior Japanese officials talking to me about it, and from well-connected Koreans, is if that happened, those countries would be forced to reach some kind of agreement with China. That China would have the ability to dictate their terms of engagement with the rest of the world. If you take Japan and South Korea and Taiwan out of the column of American friends and supporters and put them into China's friends and supporters, this is an economic, political, technological, and geopolitical revolution. It would make China the dominant nation in East Asia. And very quickly what we would find is that countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, would also have to make their peace with China, either willingly or not. And that we would see China China in a position of being able to allow or deny the United States the ability to trade with these countries in Asia. This, from the start of American history, has been one of the great American nightmares, and trying to prevent other countries from denying us access to Asia's markets and opportunities is something that American presidents have been concerned with since George Washington's day. So what we hear is that China has set a goal for itself of being ready to resolve the Taiwan issue, if necessary, by force by 2027. And there are very senior American military officials who will say that they think that's a real possibility, and that China is, and that they think that a war over Taiwan is possible in the next 2 or 3 years. There you'll hear, that's not everybody in the Navy thinks that, but I will say that there are people very senior in the Navy who are thinking this way. So that's one aspect of the challenge. Now we'll go to Russia. What is Russia's beef against the world system. Well, Russia has a laundry list of complaints, some I think justified, some less so. But the main thing is that Russia doesn't like international systems that limit Russia's freedom of action. It doesn't believe in them, and it also believes that the U.S. is a complete hypocrite, so that when we like the rules, we say, you know, like Russia can't invade Ukraine, we get all moralistic about it. But when it comes to NATO helping Kosovo become independent from Serbia, then, well, that's just a terrible sin. You know, we say, well, no, that's not a sin. That's just the way you should do it. Of course you should do this. The Russians say, well, then what does that mean about sovereignty and legal standards of, you know, a nation's right to determine its own future within its own borders? And what you did to Serbia is the same kind of thing we're doing to Ukraine. Why are you complaining here? That's one thing. But their real sense is it's not about communism. Putin is not a communist. But in the 18th and 19th century, the good old days from a Russian point of view, the Russian Tsar was one of the leaders of Europe. You did not take big decisions in Europe without the Russians having a seat at the table. If the Archduchy of Milan did not have an heir, and the powers of Europe had to figure out who the new Archduke of Milan should be, the Tsar got a vote. If you were trying to figure out whether the new Portuguese constitution should be allowed, the Tsar got a vote. And here's the thing. NATO and the European Union, from the standpoint of Russia, are institutions keeping Russia out of Europe. So that it's an idea so that France and Germany and Italy and Belgium and these other countries, they'll get together and decide what's going to happen in Europe. Russia has no say. It just has to accept whatever these countries decide. Not just to Putin, but to many Russian nationalists, this is intolerable. And it's also unrealistic. They're saying the West did all these things in the early 1990s when Russia was really weak and couldn't say anything, but we're not weak now and we're speaking our piece. And they want to see the European Union no longer able to block Russian influence in Europe, and they want NATO to no longer function as a military alliance that in effect shelters the European Union from Russia. Ukraine, just as Taiwan is the flashpoint for China's ambitions in the Far East, Ukraine is the flashpoint for Russia. I think it was Zbigniew Brzezinski who said that, you know, without Ukraine, Russia is a state. With it, it's an empire. That is to say, for Russia, having Ukraine, to them, Ukraine is as much a part of Russia in their minds as Texas is a part of the United States. If Texas, if some foreign country were to declare a protectorate over Texas and keep it out and have Texas sort of agitating it, so actually a lot of my friends in the Northeast would probably say, excellent, good riddance. But a lot of Americans would find that intolerable. I'm not talking about who's right or who's wrong. I'm just saying psychologically, a lot of Russians do feel this way. And people like Solzhenitsyn wrote about how most of Ukraine really was part of Russia and needed to be part of Russia. The other thing, though, about Ukraine that appeals to Putin is he needs them to keep his empire going, to keep Russia going. We look at population statistics that show the Russian population is declining. But if you look under the hood a little bit, you'll see that the Islamic populations in Russia are rising, but the Orthodox Slavic population, the people that I think in his heart of hearts Putin thinks are the real Russians, they are declining even faster. All right? And so where is he going to get the people to keep Russia Russian. And in Putin's mind, Ukraine and Belarus are the places. And he wants to bring them in, he wants to recruit them, force them back into the arms of Mother Russia, because it's only with that force that he can go forward on his track of making and keeping Russia a great power. And so we're now, again, we're seeing a war fought out, essentially between Russia and Ukraine, with NATO backing Ukraine, to see whether Putin's vision of Europe will prevail, whether NATO's will, or whether we'll reach some kind of a compromise. But we're already in a shooting war. There are estimates that up to 1 million people have been killed or wounded in the war. There are real concerns in Washington and elsewhere that this war could someday involve a nuclear confrontation. This is something we have not really seen on this scale in Europe since 1945. The closest we came were the Yugoslav wars. So, not good. Well, let's move to Iran. And if you've been following the news the last couple of days, you know things have been, even by Middle Eastern standards, things have been busy in the Middle East. And just the Iranians, like the Russians and the Chinese, have a vision of the way the world should be, which is not the way it is. And they want to revise things. That's why they're called revisionist powers. They want to make a revision to make the world the way it should be, really should be. And they have a very interesting vision, the people who run Iran. It's a mix of religion and geopolitics. Religiously, they are Shia Muslims, which is the minority globally in the Islamic world. Most Muslims are Sunni. But right around the Persian Gulf, actually the numbers are more equal, because you have Iran and Iraq and Bahrain have Shia majorities, and there are significant Shia minorities in other countries. So the hope is that the Shia in these countries under Iran's leadership can actually control that part of the world, giving access to two kinds of power. One is, think of having all the oil of the Persian Gulf more or less at your disposal. So the economic power of a Saudi Arabia, a Kuwait, a UAE, a Bahrain, a Qatar is all under the control of one country. That's a lot of clout and a lot of power. Plus, with that much control over oil, you can set the oil price at whatever you want it to be. And the chances are, too, you could create a lot of trouble for some countries by saying, no, I'm not selling to you. I'll sell to you, you, and you, but not you. So there's a lot of power in that. Beyond that, Mecca, the religious center of the Islamic world, where all Muslims are expected to go on pilgrimage once during their lives, if possible. Under the bad old days of Saudi rule, Mecca became a place where the sort of more extreme Wahhabi Sunni form of Islam was kind of subtly and not so subtly imposed or preached to all these people who came. But if Mecca were under Shia rule, then it could become an instrument, as the Iranians see it, to propagate their vision of Islam. And those two things would make Iran one of the world's greatest powers. Those are the stakes they're playing for. Well, unfortunately, as these three countries have come to believe that by working together, they can make inroads, they can present the United States and other upholders of the current international system with a challenge that we will be unable to overcome or to deal with. So that Russia makes some trouble in Ukraine, Iran makes some trouble in the Middle East, China pushes more Coast Guard vessels into the Philippines, pushing the Philippines back, and begins to nibble at Japan's international waters. And the United States continues to cut its defense budget, continues to tear ourselves apart over our own internal political differences. So as this process has gone forward, these countries are getting bolder and have more reason to think that they can keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing. And as a result, what we're seeing is the temperature is rising. This is a different kind of global warming, but much faster acting and potentially significantly more lethal. What we're seeing is a ratcheting up of the temperature in all of these parts of the world. Now, these countries don't like each other very much. They don't agree with each other about anything. They don't trust each other. And if the United States were to fall apart tomorrow, they would soon start to quarrel with each other. But as long as they all see the United States and the American-led world order, something I think of really as the Pax Americana, as their chief enemy, danger, and obstacle, then without having conscious, detailed plans of cooperation, they will sort of be working in parallel in ways to destabilize and weaken this order. A combination, this means that we are getting closer and closer to war. And I'll just briefly end here with a couple of thoughts about what does this mean for us. At the University of Florida, faculty, students, citizens of Gainesville, because this means a lot. For students, I think it means the most in that you guys might have been brought up to think that we were in a post-historical world. We no longer had to worry about World War and all of these like boring things that used to happen. Kind of interesting, fun to watch in a movie maybe, but not going to happen. Your life was going to be about making a good living, getting a good job, finding some personal happiness and satisfaction. And you were not going to be like your grandparents and great-grandparents drafted into a war or having to live in a country which is under the constant threat of destruction. My generation, the baby boomers, we remember the atom bomb drills during the Cuba Missile Crisis. You weren't going to have any of those things. And foreign policy was going to be about trying to, uplift, do something to improve economic or gender equality in Africa, sort of nice things like that. But that foreign policy was basically going to be kind of an elective subject in your life, not a required one. Right? That's wrong. You guys, your generation is being called, I'm afraid, by history. You're going to have to really stand up. The future of world peace, possibly the future of humanity and civilization, will depend to a large extent on whether the generations now in school or just out are able to do a better job than their predecessors in understanding world politics, planning for world politics, upholding the peace and security without which none of us have a hope of a quiet life. And I hope that at least some of you are going to make this part of your study at the University of Florida. And one of the reasons that people that people like Mr. Imboden, Dr. Imboden, and myself, Mr. Mead, are interested in the University of Florida and teaching here and trying to build programs here and working with our colleagues is our sense of the time is getting shorter and the problems are getting graver. And that as human beings and educators, we need to focus more than we've done maybe before to try to prepare you guys for something that I wish wasn't headed your way, but which increasingly I fear it is. And there's a great line in Shakespeare's play Macbeth, 2 lines, where somebody says, "Is the witch's approach?" Now, it's a witch saying this is Macbeth approaches. "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." That, I am afraid, at least for me, is my worry about the future now. Something wicked this way comes, and we need to get ready. Thank you.
There we go. Is that working? Okay, great. Walter, thank you very much. That was a sobering and rather bracing note to close on after a pretty thorough tour de horizon there. Let me begin with a possible contrary question, though, rooted in our history. For the first roughly 150 years or so of American history, there's a narrative that's grounded in some truth that we didn't have to worry a whole lot about what was happening in Europe or Asia. That we had the free security of the hemispheric repose here in North America. We could worry more. Obviously, we were expanding within our own continent, but we had the Pacific Ocean, we had the Atlantic Ocean. And then, of course, there's a little bit of that aberration in World War I, World War II. We kind of get dragged into these European and then the Asian conflicts at tremendous cost. And then we kind of take on this role as a global policeman. And that's kind of run its course. And now, once again, there's problems in Europe and Asia. But why don't we just let the Europeans and Asians solve them themselves, right? Why do we have to have this stirring summoned, this call to duty here, when we've got a peaceful neighbor to the north in Canada. We've obviously got some instability on the southern border with Mexico, but that's manageable. And then we've still got those two wonderful oceans keeping us secure.
Yeah, well, it's a thought that Americans keep coming back to, and not without reason. But when I look at the history, why did we have such a great time, say up until World War I, of being able to live in safety, having like a smaller defense budget than any major country in the world? I think in the 1880s, our Navy was smaller than Chile's, and no problems there. Why was that? The answer was that Great Britain was doing the dirty work for us. That Great Britain was doing in the 19th century a lot of what America does today. They were doing it in a very different way. They were conquering countries and coloring them pink on the map and so on. But who was keeping the oceans free for commerce? Britain. Who was providing a financial system that enabled world trade and enabled the prosperity of the United States and directed the investment into the United States that enabled us to build the railroads? It was Britain. Who was it that was keeping a balance of power in Europe so that the quarrels among the European countries were unable to expand out into the rest of the world? It was Britain. But gradually, by the late 1800s, 19th century, they were losing their touch. And it was clear that the Germans were boiling out of Europe, the French were boiling out of Europe, building colonies, building military bases, and we were getting into a situation where we could no longer count on the British system to work. And the Americans then began, this was our, quote, imperialist period. We said, okay, well then we'd better grab some islands in the Pacific to have some coaling stations for us, and we have to have the Philippines as our gateway to China, and we're going to have to start getting involved. And between about 1890 and 1945, as the British system weakens, Americans more and more are forced to deal with the consequences. In the end, we just decided, we're going to have to do it ourselves. We're going to have to replace Britain. And that's really what happened in the 40s. But, okay, so now, should we worry? I think we should. Japan bombed us. The oceans are not as secure as they used to be. Some of you may have heard of these things, airplanes they have now that cross oceans very fast. In 1820, it would take 6 weeks often to cross the Atlantic in a wooden sailing ship. And that wooden sailing ship would not be able to do very much when it got here. It could like lob a few cannon shells into New York, right? Okay, So the worst thing that could happen to the United States in 1800 was the British fleet lands and burns New York. In 2001, it wasn't even a government. An NGO, Al-Qaeda, lands some airplanes in New York and blows up the World Trade Center and causes an economic depression and a recession in the United States. What's the worst thing that could happen tomorrow? Chinese cyber attack knocks out the power. You don't have enough, your bank no longer knows how much money you've got in it. Better yet, perhaps your credit card company doesn't know how much you owe them. And that could work. The IRS may not know how much you owe it. That could be great. But our financial system deprived, our health system knocked out. We've had ransomware attacks already on the health system. So our security is no longer guaranteed by these oceans. And the United States has to take an interest in these things. At least it seems to me.
So another question, you talked in your remarks, of course, about the growing competition we have with China, even the threat of China, especially centered on Taiwan. You talked as well, of course, about Russia's revanchism and the tensions over Ukraine. But there's another dimension of this, which I know you're very aware of and have written about, which is this relatively new partnership or condominium between Russia and China, the so-called no limits partnership between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And certainly as a matter of history, this is the closest that Beijing and Moscow have been since the 1950s, and maybe ever. So how concerned should we be about this, and how enduring do you think it is? Or are they going to bump up, because of historic and geopolitical reasons, are there going to be some real limits on the so-called no limits partnership?
Well, they're already quietly stabbing each other in the back to some degree. So, Putin recently, the last thing China wanted was for North Korea to have a deep economic partnership with Russia, because China worries about North Korea, wants to keep the mad dogs of North Korea under control, and thinks that its economic role secures that. Russia is enabling North Korea to ignore China even more than it already was. And actually, the North Koreans have always been pretty good about ignoring China. Putin also visited Vietnam, which is not a place that the Chinese would like to see Vladimir Putin. But in their interest in making our lives difficult, they are as one. And if you add, many people thought when the Ukraine war began that Putin will collapse soon because the war is going to go on for a very long time. He won't be able to, we'll have sanctions, his economy will collapse, he won't be able to get missiles, he won't be able to get any of the things he needs for the war. Thanks to the No Limits partnership, Putin is gaining at our expense. He has done more to build up his weapons production than we have. And Ukraine, at the moment, is losing the war. Without China's support, that would not be possible. Meanwhile, Putin, partly, I think, in revenge for NATO, for Ukraine, has been stepping up, and partly because he needs their stuff, has been deepening his partnership with Iran. You can talk to very senior, the most senior officials in the U.S. government, and here there are now genuine fears that Russia may provide Iran with the knowledge that it needs to move very, very quickly from having processed weapons-grade uranium to actually having deliverable bombs. And I personally would say that's a lot more likely way for Putin to escalate in Ukraine than to lob a tactical nuclear weapon into Ukraine. And it seems to me that he's fingering that card and smiling at the United States. So the growing partnership among these three countries is increasing their mutual ability and making what was already a bad situation visibly worse.
That's a good segue to my next question, since you mentioned Iran there, of course, being a junior partner, but still the kind of the third leg of this new rather sinister triumvirate. So every American president, the last 7 presidents, every American president from Ronald Reagan on up through Joe Biden has arrived in office with a common conviction. And that conviction was we want to get the United States out of the Middle East. We want to do less in the Middle East. And yet every single one of those 7 presidents has also, in different ways, found himself dragged into the Middle East. Should we be in the Middle East? And if so, why?
All right. Yeah, it is a little bit like Michael Corleone. Every time I try to get out, they drag me back in. Well, the fact that 7 presidents have tried and failed to get out of the Middle East does suggest that maybe we should have a president who says, okay, we're going to be there. What is the least bad way we can be there? And I think a little bit more of this kind of thinking could help, because 7 presidents with 7 very different ideas about the national interest, 7 very different strategies, have found it impossible to stay out. Now, Nixon, who also would have liked to do less there, got dragged in because the U.S. had become dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And the Middle Eastern powers were able to withhold our supply. I look around the room, there are people here old enough to remember the gas lines of the 1970s, the rationing that we faced. It was a pretty bad experience. No president wants to explain to people why we're having that again. Just as, by the way, President Biden really doesn't want Vice President Harris to talk about a massive economic crisis caused by spikes in the oil price heading up to an election. So oil remains critical, like it or not. But there are other issues that matter too. One of them is money. The sovereign wealth funds of countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait are enormous, and these are unlike and they're concentrated. So that in America we have a zillion hedge fund managers making all kinds of different decisions, pension fund managers doing different things. But in Saudi Arabia, there's like one guy who can move hundreds of billions of dollars this way and that way. Well, first of all, we don't want them doing something like shorting treasuries just when we're trying to deal with interest rates. But also, we don't want that money to go, for example, investing in AI in China and Russia. We want that money coming to us and helping. We want their help in building a system of tech that provides us with a measure of protection against some of the interference that we see happening and ensures that we and our friends will stay at the cutting edge. There's also the question of terrorism. Some of you may have noticed, again, that far from becoming weaker, in the last few years we've seen a resurgence of this jihadist terror movements, that they are recovering ground. In Africa, they've spread enormously, taking advantage of the fall of Gaddafi and a few other things. The French have been, between the Russians and the terrorists, the French have been driven out of Africa. In itself, perhaps not a bad thing, but those are not the candidates I would have chosen to replace them. And we are seeing, again, you talk to people who follow what's going on in the intelligence world, and they will tell you that the threats are becoming substantially greater. So another 9/11. An alliance between Middle Eastern money and hostile great powers and oil. These remain very, very serious issues. Presidents can't ignore them. You might want to ignore them, but you can't. So since we've got to deal with it, all right, we need to think hard about, okay, what's the best way to manage our policy here? Who are the people that we can count on? Who are the people we need to worry about? And how do we make sure that our guys stay together and work with us? What do they need from us? What do we need from them? Let's be clear, let's be focused, and let's try to do this with the minimum of effort, because after all, we do have a lot of other things to do, both in other parts of the world and most importantly, here at home.
All right, one more question from me, and after this one, which I'm about to put to Walter, we'll turn to the audience for questions. So be thinking about those. We've got a couple of volunteers who'll be running around with microphones, so we'll turn those to you in a second. Walter, you've also written extensively, especially in Special Providence and then in God and Gold, about economic history, the development, evolution of the international economic order, especially the Hamiltonian tradition in the United States, of course, our namesake here of supporting, promoting international trade as being seen as good for the American economy and for preserving some global stability. But just as I mentioned in the previous question, this bipartisan consensus about getting out of the Middle East, of late, protectionism is also another bipartisan pastime, it seems, that, the major, the presidential candidates for both parties, bipartisan majorities in Congress, are not enthused about more free trade, and if anything, seem more prone towards protectionist measures. Is that understandable, and is it wise?
Okay, it is certainly understandable, and I should say, and anybody who knows much about the life or the thought of Alexander Hamilton would know that Hamilton was not a doctrinaire free marketer, and in fact supported some forms of industrial protection and national economic strategy for the U.S. So this is not, in my mind anyway, it's not a straight up and down libertarian versus communist kind of discussion. And as a practical matter, speaking now, what I would say is we certainly do need some types of protection. For example, think hard about what just happened in Lebanon with those pagers and walkie-talkies. We need to know what is going into the things that are essential to our lives. And besides those obvious physical dangers, the South Koreans recently found that they had purchased some surveillance equipment that they were using on a military base from China, and that this without them knowing it, this equipment was sending information to China about what was going on this military base. So we are not, it is not compatible with national security to just sort of sit back and say laissez-faire, laissez-passer, whatever. There is a strong and serious national security argument for rethinking our trade policy. Beyond that, the World Trade Organization has been a failure at promoting free trade. And China has systematically cheated. China's not the only one, but it is the most visible and the most impactful, systematically bent or broken the rules in a whole set of ways that have fundamentally distorted the economic development of the world. And people sometimes talk about, this in terms of, oh, well, the American factory workers who've lost their jobs, but it's not just that. It's that Egypt can't compete with China. A lot of poor countries have been unable to compete with this focused Chinese stuff. And so, is high unemployment in the Arab world driving support for terrorism and increasing instability? Yes, it is. And have the failures of the international trading system to deal with abuse contributed to that problem? Yes, they have. So we do need to think more actively about trade. But at the same time, a national security problem may make us bend the laws of economics, but it doesn't make the laws of economics go away. When you have protection, you start sprinkling sand in the gears of your economy. Things get expensive, things become in short supply. It just gets harder to do the things that you need to do. And it can be necessary. I suppose it's like treating cancer with chemotherapy. You have to treat cancer with chemotherapy, but the chemotherapy will also make you sick. And you have to be very sure that whoever is handing it out isn't like overdosing you because they sort of think of, this is a cure-all, just more is better. That'll kill you too. So I worry when some of the people who are talking about, who seem to think protectionism is the answer to every economic problem, when they're the ones planning this. I think we need to get people who actually believe in trade involved in helping to rethink how we manage our trade. There's one other piece of this I'll just quickly go over, and that is in 1850, over half of the American population made its living on farms. And today, only about 1% of the population makes its living on farms. That's a big shift. And during much of that time, family farmers have been becoming less prosperous compared to the rest of the country. If family farming was still the most prosperous way to make a living, 50% of the population would still be on the farm, right? But it isn't, and it can't be, and it's a good thing that it isn't. It was productivity that meant rising agricultural productivity meant we didn't need as many people growing the food. Well, in manufacturing, the real thing happening here is that rising productivity means we don't need as many people on factory floors as we used to. You can make a car with a lot fewer people, whether they are Korean or Vietnamese or American or whatever. And manufacturing is moving, like farming, out of the sort of, it will never again be the mainstay of a significant share of the population, the way it used to be. Whether you protect everything or you protect nothing, that's going to happen. Now, during all of this time, what we had in America were policies often introduced by people playing violins and talking about the suffering of the poor family farmer and how sad it was, and big subsidy programs, which did not actually stop the movement of people away from the farm, but did put a lot of money into a lot of corporate pockets, mostly corporate pockets. And the larger farmers and the more organized lobby groups had the most impact on shaping the agricultural subsidy laws, and still do. My guess is we're in for 100 years of bad manufacturing policy based on, the poor blue-collar workers, and yet somehow the money will probably not end up with the blue-collar workers. Will end up with the shareholders of the big corporations like other things do. But that won't stop people from playing the violin, and it probably won't stop Congress from passing laws. So we're going to, these are costs of doing business. One needs to realize they have big downsides, do the best that you can to work with them. You have to be pragmatic and practical about these things, but you should try to be clear-sighted if you can.
All right, now to questions from the audience. We got Will Fletcher back there with the microphone for anyone. Because I'm seeing a couple. Let's take this one right here. Will, let's right, you with the beard. And our request is that your question be short, polite, to the point, and have a question mark at the end.
Yes, sir. So I'd like to address the last part of your lecture. So Lee Kuan Yew used to say, if you could capture the spirit of the United States, it would be a motto: we start from scratch and we beat you. So what I see now, a bit of demoralization, recruitment for police, military down, population collapse, and a bloated bureaucracy. What caused it? How do we fix it?
Okay, well, there are lots of reasons to be worried, but one thing about America is it's been in decline my whole life. All right? Okay, when I was born in 1952, and by 1955, everyone believed the Russians had beaten the Americans forever in outer space. They had satellites, we didn't. They were landing, their space program was ahead of ours. So when I went to grade school in the 6th grade, they changed the way everybody in America learned math, set theory, Venn diagrams. I was ready for Vice President Harris. Okay, I got that stuff in the 2nd grade, baby. And this Then by early 1960s, it's the missile gap. Russia was ahead of us in missiles. Also the trade gap, our trade deficit, where the gold was flowing out of Fort Knox. We were over. Then the civil rights movement. We're so divided, we'll never recover. Then the Vietnam War. Oh, America has lost its innocence. We are so bitterly divided. And honestly, the late 60s, early 70s were far worse in terms of polarization, riots, and disorder than anything going on, even on college campuses. I probably shouldn't say this at the University of Florida, but you guys just don't seem to be able to pitch a good riot like we could. We boomers, we were tough, but that's a subject for another day maybe. But anyway, so, then you have the oil price, the inflation, polarization. America's over, America's over, America's over. And yet, like in the national anthem, you can see the flag is still there. My guess is that this turbulence is a feature, not a bug, of American society and an aspect of the dynamism that keeps us going. It doesn't mean it isn't uncomfortable at times, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't work on our problems, but this dissatisfaction and worry is part of the social mechanism, I think, that keeps us focused on, oh, it's a problem, we need to do something about it, as opposed to, oh, right? Great.
Yes, right here, Will. The gentleman in the front row. Yeah.
Hi, as somebody born in 1945, I enjoyed your descriptions of what went on when we were ducking under our desks, waiting to be incinerated. I want to pay you a compliment first. I didn't hear you say, once during your presentation this evening. It was fluent, it was very engaging, and it could have been transcribed, and you could have printed it all out and made a book out of it. It was really excellent, and I want to thank you for that. The question, though, has to do with the idea of a world system or an international system. That's a phrase that you used. And it seems to me with the power that oil has for ecological things, for global phenomena, as well as for politics and wars and things, it seems to me that the first step in establishing this world system is gaining control of all the oil fields and the production, and making sure that's taken care of. What's your comment on that thought?
Well, I would say that oil is one of a number of commodities whose ample production and wide distribution is essential to the functioning of civilization. And in fact, American policy in terms of making sure that agricultural products flowed to the rest of the world was also very great. I wouldn't put oil kind of in a lone trophy box there. And I would also say that increasingly it's things like information are replacing physical commodities as the essence of, that doesn't mean physical commodities are losing all importance, but they are less of the center of strategic thinking, economic decision-making now than they used to be. And perhaps in the future, lithium is going to matter more and oil less as things change. So I would hesitate to really elevate oil. I would use it as an example rather than as a definition, if that helps.
All right, other questions? Yes, over here. Yeah, with the white blouse. That's right, thanks. Yeah, thanks. And the microphone is coming away. So, yeah.
So there's a lot of preoccupation, obviously, with Russia, with China, with Ukraine. Where does Latin America kind of burble up here? What's its role? Where does it sit?
Well, I would say, I agree with you with maybe the premise of, the unstated premise of your question that we're not thinking enough about Latin America. I definitely agree with that. And I think the United States we are about to experience, or we're already beginning to experience, and there could well be more, disagreeable consequences for not thinking hard enough about our neighborhood. Essentially, I would argue since the 1990s, America's been kind of coasting in international relations generally. Hey, it's the end of history, what me worry, is the kind of approach that we've seen. And so we've seen the erosion of democratic and institutional norms all across in much of Latin America. We're seeing a really painful and worrying failure to develop and to create prosperity. You can also say that America has had two foreign policies vis-a-vis our neighbors, our neighborhood. One is the government official policy, let's support development, let's support institutions and all of this. But the policy of the American people is let's snort all the coke up our nose that we can possibly get. And if that means that vicious narco traffickers become the most powerful economic and then political actors in neighboring countries, we don't care, I like coke. And that, all right, and that's us in a mirror there. And government in a free society, and actually even in a not free society, is powerless to do much about it. I remember after 9/11, people were talking about, how the danger of smuggling a nuclear weapon into the United States. And somebody in the Coast Guard said, well, obviously, the best way to do it would be to put a nuclear weapon in a shipment of cocaine, because our interdiction rate is so low, the chances are great that it would get through. So we've got to, this gets us to something which is very important, which is that there is no substitute for virtue. And if people are going to behave badly, bad things are going to happen. And we are, we're not going to build utopia. Nothing that I or anybody here is going to do is going to stop a lot of Americans from reaching for their favorite drug. But we can reflect and be aware, and we can try to shape our policy both to limit the damage, limit the harm, and limit the problem. But we need to, it's easy to blame Guatemala. Why don't those people behave? Without understanding fully just how forces over which they have no control have given them some really bad choices. We need to think much more deeply. John F. Kennedy once said, Americans will do anything for South America except read about it. We should at least think about it, because we haven't, and we are now experiencing consequences of that failure.
All right, we've got Natalia here in the front row, one of the student leaders of the Hamilton Society chapter, so one of our wonderful student organizations devoted to thinking about foreign policy.
Hi, I'm Natalia. I'm a third year here at UF. So we're seeing this trend about demanding more transparency within our institutions and supply chains when it comes to China. So now the House Committee on Competition with the CCP released a report talking about the company CATL, which has to do with electric vehicles and the obscene percentage of U.S. supply chains that they occupy. And now universities are demanding more transparency with research that is complicit with the CCP and benefiting them and helping their intelligence gathering. So as we're headed into the election and seeing competing foreign policy strategies with China, whether it's this strategic de-risking espoused by the left and strategic decoupling espoused more by the right, where do you stand on the future of American foreign policy with China and their involvement in our institutions and supply chains?
Well, I would honestly have to say that at this point in the election, I don't see a coherent China policy on either side. I see politicians desperately reaching out for votes. I think Vice President Harris has never had that much reason in her career to focus on foreign policy rather than domestic. Now, I think her advisors are probably correctly telling her that her wisest course is to say as little as possible on the topic, on any topic, really, until the election is safely over, while Donald Trump's advisors know that he won't take their advice no matter what it is, so why bother? And we're in this really interesting position where, at least, Vice President Harris has repudiated or let her aides repudiate for her in conversations with reporters almost every position she's ever held, while Donald Trump has simply said so many contradictory things to so many people. We don't have any idea what, if anything, either of them would actually do. Happy voting is all I can say.
All right, we've got time for one more question. This gentleman in the black shirt here. So, if you can take it over. Right.
Very interesting conversation. My question to you is, and I was surprised that you didn't touch onto that, is from a geopolitical perspective, do you think that U.S. has made the right decision to continue supporting Israel, especially when you have all these countries in the Middle East that literally hate Israel, and Israel has killed about 40,000 people with U.S.-made bombs? And so, and I'm not taking one side or the other, but I'm just thinking from a geopolitical perspective. It seems to me that when will that end? We are creating more enemies, than we can handle, I think. So can you please comment on that?
And let me suggest it might be a good idea to write a book on U.S.-Israel relations. So he's recently published one of this, so it's a good question. Yeah.
And I think, well, one thing to understand is that America is not a country where we have one idea of the national interest and everybody agrees with it. And so you'll often have a Secretary of State, even in the same administration, a Secretary of State with one idea about the national interest, a Secretary of Defense with another, Secretary of the Treasury with another. So it's sort of, why is America doing something is actually a very complicated question. On why the Biden administration, let's just make it specific because that's who's been doing it. Why the Biden administration, while complaining endlessly about Israel and not giving Israel everything it wants, why has it 11 years into the bloodiest war since Israel's independence, why has it continued providing Israel with very large supplies of weapons and also significant, though again not unlimited, diplomatic backing? And this is particularly interesting because this is an administration that took power planning, its main approach to the Middle East was going to be an approach to Iran, Israel's arch enemy. So what happened? Why have we gotten here? I'd say first, let's remember that Israel isn't the only country in a way where there was a flip or something of a flip. Saudi Arabia, when Biden, the president, was running for the presidency in the fall of 2020, said so we're going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah nation, and we're going to really bring in some accountability to the crown prince because of the murder of the Washington Post columnist. Let me just say that as a newspaper columnist, I strongly object to murders of American columnists. I believe in a strict no bone saws rule. Very important. Anyway, what happens is, first of all, Iran said no. We don't want to be your friend, Mr. Biden. We hate you. In fact, death to you, America. And we will continue to do everything we possibly can to kill Americans around the Middle East, to make life a living hell for anybody who wants to be your friend. And any chance we get to cozy up to your other great antagonists, Russia and China, we will take it in a heartbeat. Well, that's a problem, all right? And so then you start thinking, what's the best? Oh, and by the way, we're going to continue developing our nuclear weapon. What is now, from an American point of view, the best way to deal with a country that is well on its way to taking over the Middle East? I mean, look at what, since 2003, Iran has basically managed, it now is the strongest, its proxy Hezbollah runs Lebanon, its ally Assad runs Syria, and Iran has a lot of authorities able to use Syria as a weapons depot and transshipment basis. It's replaced America easily as the most influential outside actor in Iraq. and pro-Iranian militias are actually firing weapons from Iraq at American bases. It is threatening the Saudis. It is threatening, sort of everywhere. All right, what are we going to do? Well, let's see. We could have a war with Iran, and the Biden administration says we don't want a war with Iran. Okay, so we've got to find some local countries, some allies who will help us here. Well, what's the list? It turns out that kind of Israel and Saudi Arabia are the, number 1 and number 2 on that list. All right, and there isn't much else on that list. So even if you had absolutely no emotional sympathy for Israel or Saudi Arabia, and my guess is that there are people in the Biden administration who have no sympathy with either one, right? You actually need to work pragmatically with them. And you also can't allow Israel to be defeated. So, and then in terms of the worry about the Arab world, what is striking here is that the Arab governments, who certainly are not always representative of public opinion, but the Arab governments have basically quietly mostly taken Israel's side against Iran. So that in the negotiations over the ceasefire in Hamas, the U.S. and Qatar, which is the one Gulf country that is kind of pro-Hamas, pro-Muslim Brotherhood anyway, have been pushing Israel as hard as they can, while the Saudis and the Emiratis have been sort of quietly saying to the Israelis, no, get them. So it's from all of these perspectives, you can see why this is a choice that President Biden, primarily out of a desire to avoid a war with Iran, would find himself drawn into. My guess is that his successor, whether Republican or Democratic, will find a lot of these arguments very persuasive too.
All right, well, thank you very much, Walter. Our time is coming to a close, I'm afraid, but I do want to just add 2 final comments here. First, Walter is going to be teaching an undergraduate class this spring through the Hamilton Center on American foreign policy. So undergraduates here, keep an eye out for that. If you've enjoyed this tonight, imagine an entire semester of this wisdom. And then second, the fact that we've all been able to enjoy the gathering here tonight, that the lights are on, the microphones worked, that the food was delicious, is all thanks to the wonderful Cheryl Irvin and Drayton Cullen. So please join me in giving them both a big hand. And please, of course, join me in giving Walter a big hand as well. Thank you very much.